Thank you so much, Tracee, for spending time with us in conversation today. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much for having me, Juliana. I appreciate being here.
So let me ask you first, you have been in the Sri Vidya Tantra tradition for almost 3 decades now. Could you share with us what Sri Vidya is?
Hmm. Sri Vidya is the practice of moving towards what is and discovering what is your most essential self by the way of understanding and being with what is most auspicious, what is joyful, what is beautiful, and the knowledge of that, which really anchors us in the knowledge of the goddess.
Oh, that is a wonderful description of it. Is this a Hindu tradition?
It is. It's a Hindu tradition that I was initiated into in 2001 um, through the lineage of the Himalayan Masters. So you may be familiar with Pandit Rajmani Tiganayat, who is the spiritual head of the Himalayan Institute in Pennsylvania. There is the Swami Rama Sadakagrama that is in Rishikesh that was led by Swami Veda Bharati. Those are the two main teachers that I studied with, along with a teacher by the name of Rod Stryker. Those are the teachings that I really consider to be the foundational teachings that I learned over years before starting to kind of understand and study other lineages and other wisdom traditions.
So you wrote two beautiful and practical books. The first one called Radiant Rest is about Yoga Nidra. Can you tell us a bit about the origins of Yoga Nidra and the more modern take on it? And most importantly, what has been your experience with it?
That's a beautiful question. That's very layered. So I'll start with, I think, what our understanding is when we hear in the Western world the two words yoga and nidra together. A lot of times people think about, oh, this is a yoga nap because I've heard that this is called the yoga of sleep. And we think about it as a technique. And that's really kind of cutting it short when we think about Yoga Nidra as only a technique. The technique is a lot of times, and it's different for many teachers, but most of the time we're laying down in a supine position. We are being asked by our teacher to allow them to guide us through a journey where there's some kind of systematic deep relaxation. There's a focus on the breath, some sort of probably diaphragmatic breathing, some sort of visualization, and then there's some silence and spaciousness. Um, but there's so much more to the practice of Yoga Nidra because Yoga Nidra is also a state of consciousness, right? And so if we think about the symbol and the sound of Om, all of those states of consciousness, the waking, the dreaming, the deep sleep, and what is called the fourth state, Turiya, are all represented in this beautiful symbol of Om. And they also are represented in the practice of yoga. Yoga Nidra being close to that space of Turiya, the fourth state, which is also known as the void, right? This place that is said to be both empty and full and is really beyond description, right? It's said that when you reach this place, you might not even know that you were there, but when you come back, the fragrance of that experience comes back with you, and you know that you have been to this place that feels like it was peace beyond words. So we can think about Yoga Nidra as a technique. We can think about Yoga Nidra as a state of consciousness. And we can also and should also think about Yoga Nidra as a goddess, the goddess that has this energy of nurturing, of holding, of compassion and beauty. She has a moon like energy. And you don't have to think of the goddess as a personified being, but you can think about the qualities of nurturing, the qualities of mother, the qualities of being held. And that's really where we are allowing ourselves to be held unconditionally when we're in this practice of yoga nidra. And when we're there, it really allows for things to be revealed, because it feels like a place that we can start to let go. We can start to let go of what isn't true, what isn't free within us. And when we do that, we eventually kind of bring ourselves back to this eternal, essential self. We only feel perhaps or become aware of prana, and then we allow prana to guide us back to source. So yoga nidra is a very nuanced practice. I would say, to answer the other layer of um, your question, is that my relationship with yoga nidra really shifted when I began to understand that yoga nidra was also a goddess.
Mm.
My first experiences with yoga nidra were very technique based. Like, this is the way you do it. Don't move a muscle, and it's very strict and very disciplined. And there was never any mention, really, of the goddess. There was never any mention, really, even of the teacher known as Mataji, who was the one who taught this practice to Swami Rama, who then brought it to the West. And so it somehow became very disconnected in my understanding from the goddess. And so when I was able to read more and learn more about the practice, um, especially how it relates to the story of Vishnu being asleep on the cosmic ocean. And in that cosmic ocean, Brahma is growing out of his belly. And then all of these demons, or these two demons, Madhu and Kataiba, too little and not enough, start attacking Brahma. And he's reaching out for Vishnu, his protector and preserver, to wake up, but he's in the cosmic sleep of Yoga Nidra. And so he has to call on the goddess Yoga Nidra to come and wake up Vishnu, to basically save the universe. And so you really start to understand that in these beautiful stories, the power of sleep, the power of repose, the power of the goddess, that even the gods were helpless without her power and without her grace. And it's just the same for us. If we don't have the power of rest in our lives, if we don't have the power of deep, restful sleep in our lives, we will not be able to function. We will not be able to be living in a way that is life affirming, because we're always going to feel drained. The origins of the practice, to answer your last layer of the question, from my understanding, I think there's probably many origins that we don't even know about, certainly that I don't know about. But the one that I really love to talk about comes from the Mahanirvana Tantra. And the Mahanirvana Tantra talks about the practice of placing, it's a practice called nyasa, placing or planting or anointing, consecrating the body with mantra or with
Mm.
deities. And that this practice of consecrating or anointing the body, and there are many different definitions of this word nyasa, is the act of consecrating the body so that we remember it and know it as a divine temple, as a divine vessel. And from what I have learned and understood, is that these practices that we associate now with Yoga Nidra as being the rotation of consciousness throughout the body comes from this practice of placing attention to all these different places in the body, to almost like reassemble the body as a divine temple.
It sparked in me a lot of the need of resting and nurturing and opening up. When you mentioned the goddess of opening up to the present, that constant presence that is there, and on the day-to-day experience of rushing and doing, we become so disconnected with So thank you for the depth of your answers. I would like to talk a little bit about your upcoming book. Um, that is called The Luminous Self: Sacred Yogic Practices and Rituals to Remember Who You Are, which, by the way, everyone can already pre-order on Trace's website, and is coming out on October 10th. So in the introduction of the book, you say there is no doing yoga. Yoga is a state of being. Would you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think that it's an understanding that we all come to at some point if we practice yoga long enough. I know for me, when I first started practicing yoga, it was about the doing. It's like, oh, you do the asana. I'm rolling out my mat. I'm about to do yoga. And I think that that's very common in Western yoga classes, right? That we start to feel as though I'm only doing yoga when I roll out the mat, or I'm in front of my computer with the teacher, or I'm in the yoga studio with the teacher, or I'm doing my own practice. That's my yoga practice. And I really feel that yoga is the practice of life, right? And that life is the sacred ritual. And I really also believe that these practices were meant for us to weave through our lives. I don't think that the original seers of yoga that were in the forest were thinking about, oh, let's roll out our woven mat and this is when we're going to practice yoga. I think that just like you were talking about earlier, um, the beautiful description of how I was explaining the practices, it's like this is the reflection of Sri as well. It's like we see the beauty and the auspiciousness in everything, everywhere. You know, when we're in nature, when we're seeing a baby laughing or a deer walking by, there's always a moment that we become present and we become present to the beauty. And I think all of those moments are yoga, right? We can think about the yamas and the niyamas, which, you know, maybe in the olden days, we shouldn't even have been practicing any other kind of yoga unless we had really been studying the yamas and the niyamas for a long time. And sometimes those codes of ethics of how we treat ourselves and how we treat others just gets kind of thrown to the side, right? And I think that if we're really thinking about the yamas and the niyamas, then yoga does begin to become infused in our life in a different way. It's more than just doing some poses or doing some breathing practices. It really becomes something where all 8 limbs are present at any time. We can notice them, we can remember them, we can feel something different other than just the fact that we are our physical body. We can remember that we are something that is beyond name and form, and we can inquire into what that is. So for me, yoga being a state of consciousness is also constantly being in the inquiry of what is happening now? What am I feeling now? Where am I now? Who am I? And asking these questions consistently, pausing for reflection, and having that be something that weaves through life as much as possible. It's not to say that there are days where, or times when I'm in the forgetting, because that happens anytime distraction comes in. But I think if we think about yoga as a life practice, then it changes our practice or what we think we're practicing anyway.
Absolutely. Yes, in the book you offer very useful instances of introspection and self-inquiry, as you were just saying, within the frame of some key aspects of yoga philosophy. And one of the very insightful questions you ask the reader is, what part of you is dying and what part of you is waiting to be born? Could you share with us the importance of this point that is not always at the forefront of spiritual practices?
Yeah, I think that during the pandemic, the early pandemic, there was so much fear and uncertainty. And there were so many people that knew people that were ill or people who had passed away. And what I noticed is that we were, as a collective, wholly unprepared to face death, to face our own death, to face the death of others. And because we don't really have, as a culture in the West, any real initiations into holding space for those who are passing over, or holding space for those who have passed over, other than a funeral, right? Or someone who's a caretaker maybe comes to their own rituals and ways of being with someone who is leaving this earth. That inquiry kind of dropped in as a reflection of nature, because I think when we watch and are with nature, even if you have a garden or you have a plant somewhere in your house, you know that there is this time of blooming and there is this time of things going fallow and seeming as though maybe they're completely dead. But during that fallow time, there's still something happening in the underground, something that we can't see. And then at some point, something comes up, and we don't know what that something is going to exactly look like, but something eventually will bloom. And so I think that when we think about nature and that reflection of nature within us, because we are nature, our essential nature is nature, that we have to consider this inquiry. What is it within me that is dying? Because then if I ask that question, not so far as to say, when will I die or how will I die, but what's in me that's already dying? What's in me that I'm ready to let go of, that I'm ready to compost back into the earth so that something else can be born? And how many times over my lifetime have I died and been reborn? How many times have I let go of something? Have I reinvented myself? Have I come anew? Those are all ways of dying and rebirthing yourself. And if we can become more comfortable with the fact that those cycles and those transitions happen many, many times during the day, many, many times during our life, we have seasons of life that are different, that I think maybe that starts to open the doorway to becoming more comfortable with these ideas and thoughts around impermanence that I think are really important for us to have and to contemplate.
Thank you. Yes, I was reflecting on, this part of us that, even from a psychological standpoint, or sometimes when you mention in the book, the personality versus the true self, the inner self. So which aspects of us are making room for the new to come as we die in those small ways.
Beautiful.
I personally appreciated the maturity of experience in your book that resulted in so many helpful practical applications. And I also found some teachings I had never come across with before, especially the one on grunties, these energetic knots that exist in the subtle body. We usually, hear about the chakras and the centers, the energy centers in the subtle bodies, but not of these knots or these other aspects. So could you speak a little bit about them?
Yeah, so the grunties are known as psychic knots. And when I first heard about them many years ago, I had been studying the chakras. And, I think we all in spiritual, a lot of us have this fascination with the chakras, right? It's like, I'm going to open my chakras, I'm going to balance my chakras. And when this teacher introduced this idea of the grunties, these psychic knots, I was like, what are you talking about? I need to know more about this. Where are these knots? And what I learned about the psychic knots that are essentially kind of base of spine, heart center, throat to third eye area is that these are like the accumulation of the samskaras, of the vasanas from this life and other lifetimes that accumulate in these places. And that part of our journey on the yogic path is to slowly unwind these knots. These knots, and depending on the teaching, are supposed to be there. They're supposed to be there because they help and they prevent Kundalini Shakti from rising too fast. And so it's interesting because when we think about our culture of wanting things quickly and wanting to have that instant gratification, there's a lot of, I just want to put a fire hose on my practice and I want to be enlightened tomorrow. But it's almost like these grunties are there as like a safety mechanism to keep us safe and to let us know that our practice has to go little by little to open up and to release so that we can see what it is there to learn. I think that when we go too fast through our spiritual practices, sometimes we miss a lot of what's important. And so these grunties are said to be loosened by certain practices like mantra, physical practices like bandhas. So if we think about Mula Bandha, Uddiyana Bandha, Jalandhara Bandha, all of those areas are affecting the grantis. And Mahabandha, which is all three bandhas to get done at the same time, is said to be the great seal, right? And that practice is said to really accelerate the opening of these psychic knots. And so I think it's really important for us as we do our physical practice, as we do more subtle practices, to just begin to notice where we may be holding more blocked energy in certain parts of the body. And a lot of times it will make sense because maybe there's a heartbreak or maybe there's a grief that still needs to be processed. And it's not to say that you need to do it quickly, but to be able to know that that's there and to have the support of practices or a therapist or a spiritual teacher to be able to help you to move through whatever those blockages might be.
Would you say they're also related to attachments or to things we don't want to let go of or change?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Um, the grunties at the base of the spine have a lot to do with attachment to what we consider to be more than our basic needs. So attachment to money, attachment to material objects, attachment to um, status, things like that, right? We already talked about the heart, so there could be grief there, there could be heartbreak there. Third eye, kind of throat area, could be more attachment to our psychic abilities, right? Attachment to our practice in a way that's unhealthy. Expectation from practices like, oh, I had such a beautiful, mind-blowing meditation, and now I'm going to sit down and I want to have that same thing every single time I meditate. We know that that's not the case. So those types of things are very common. I think that these grunties, the reason I put them in the book actually is because they're not often taught. And unless you're looking in the right place, like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, uh, then you might find them. But I have not met many teachers who talk about these grunties.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful. And now that you mentioned the heart, as you in the book, as you speak of the luminous self, you mentioned that this true self resides in the lotus of the heart. And this has been not only a repeated message in many, many traditions, but also a repeated symbol. What took you there, and what has been your perception of the lotus of the heart?
That's such a beautiful question. So I think the first thing that I would say is the sutra, the Yoga Sutra that sent me on my path of seeking was Yoga Sutra 136. Prior to reading that sutra, I had been practicing power yoga, Kundalini yoga, And the teachers that I was practicing with were not really talking about philosophy. It was really just like show up to class, do these physical postures, do this breathing, lay down, and you're going to feel amazing. And when I was going on my first yoga retreat, I picked up a book. I had never heard of the Yoga Sutras, but it had the word yoga on it. So I was like, oh, this is a pretty cover. Let me just take this book with me on my retreat. And when I started reading this translation of the Yoga Sutras, one of the first things that I started to notice was this vibration. And now I recognize that that vibration felt like a transmission. I didn't have the words for the transmission when I was reading it, but it was definitely a transmission. When I got to Sutra 136, it talked about this place within us that is in the heart that is beyond all sorrow. Something about those words, beyond all sorrow, was like, wait a second, what do you mean? There's a place within me that's beyond all sorrow, that's beyond all conditioning. This place is eternal. It's effulgent. It's luminous. It was there before I had a name. It will be there when I no longer have a body. This is who I really am. I need to shift and find a yoga teacher that can lead me to the promises of what is being talked about in the Yoga Sutras. And so that was how I found the tradition of the Himalayan Masters, because I asked around, and I kept getting pointed to one or two teachers. And that's how I made my way to Sri Vidya Tantra. So from there, it really became about, what are these practices? What are these philosophies? And I was given a practice early on, and there are many practices, as you know, that focus around the heart center and focus around the light of the heart and illuminating, remembering, awakening, revealing this light in the heart center. But I was given a practice that is called the cave of the heart. That is one of the, I don't want to say secret, but it's not a widely taught practice in public. And I received this practice probably, I think it was in 2005. And I started doing this practice, and it was essentially illuminating, right? Of being able to see, feel, and sense that there was something there. And it wasn't like a mind blowing experience, it was like a sliver, a moment. And that moment led to other moments later that had nothing to do with me being quote unquote in meditation or in a yoga practice, but out in nature or with another person. And this is where we go back to what we talked about earlier, is that yoga is life. Yoga is either in the room or it's not. And it doesn't have anything to do with if you're on your yoga mat or if you're sitting in meditation. And so for me, I feel like once I had that just small sliver of seeing and feeling and reading so many different translations of Sutra 136, as a yoga teacher, I felt like, how would our practice change if this was our aim? If our aim was not standing up in handstand in the middle of the room balancing, but our aim was, can we touch, can we taste this place within us that is beyond all sorrow? How will our lives change if we know that even if we go through the ups and downs, even when we go through the births and deaths, that there's still the place within us that is eternal and bright? And that is what keeps me teaching and keeps me practicing and just wanting to know more and to be more of who I really am in the world.
And we're blessed to have you. Thank you for sharing that. You seem to have integrated several traditions in your teaching. And so at some point in the book, you introduce the concept of ancestors.
Mm.
How did that integration come into being?
Mm. It came into being a couple of different ways. I think the first way was I was in a class with a teacher, and that teacher had asked us to visualize the guru in the heart center. And for whatever reason, at that moment, I was like, wait a second. I have an upaguru. I have my father who's no longer here, who's really the head of my closest ancestor, my closest lineage holder. And why am I not connecting with my own lineage? And so I started to go down a path of learning more about ancestral veneration, ancestral wisdom. I did my own DNA. There were members of my close family, like my grandfather, whose kind of story had been lost because he died before I was born. And, like some cultures, they just don't like to talk about like anything. It's like something from the past, so we're not going to talk about that story. And so there was not a lot of information that I could get about him. Um, and I had studied with a teacher just before the pandemic and kind of through the pandemic around ancestral wisdom, which brought a lot of information. And then I started reading different things and creating my ancestor altar. And what transpired after creating the ancestor altar was just magical. All sorts of stories started to come forth. People who I didn't know I was related to started to come forth with pictures. New family members, pictures from the 1800s started popping up of my great great grandparents. So what I know is that in order for us to know who we really are, a piece of that is touching back into our own lineage and being able to reclaim, especially for those of us who came from people who were stolen from their lands or people who were enslaved, whose rituals were erased, who languages were erased. The memory of them was erased. That was part of the colonization, is to erase the memory of the power of your own lineage. And so that to me is something that needs to be reclaimed in order for us to remember our wholeness. We're already whole. We're already brilliant. But to remember that we are, I feel like connecting these pieces and connecting these dots is really important. And the more you uh, kind of become aware of this ancestral realm, you realize that there are guides, there are benevolent beings around us all the time. And some of those benevolent beings are our own ancestors who had prayed for us many, many years ago that are still with us now. So there's a lot more we can say about the ancestral realm and the healing that can take place when you start to honor your ancestors. I know a lot of people don't know who their ancestors are because they may be adopted, but you can do things like a DNA test and you can find out where your people are from. And you can do the very simple things like just starting to bring in the foods that they ate, right? And going back to visit those places as a way to connect to your ancestors and the people that you come from.
One final and more personal question. You mentioned Sri RamanaMaharshi in your writings. Uh, have his teachings play an important part in your spiritual life?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, this is, you know, in some ways, I wish I would have found his teachings before I did a single asana. Because things would have been maybe a little bit smoother. Um, it was a teacher that I was sitting with early in my um, practice, this was in 2001, who just made a very offhanded comment, and I write about it in the book, where they said, "I'm not sure you've ever tasted your true nature." And I was like, what is true nature? What is this? Who am I? It started to bring this question, who am I? And I had not known about the teachings of Sri Maharshi yet. And so when I learned not too long after about this teacher and this inquiry, I was like, oh my God, this is like the essential question. This is the question we should all be asking, because not only do I need to know who I am, but I also need to know who I'm not. And then I learned later that there was a teaching around that. And so for me, I love self-inquiry. And that's part of the weaving that I do in my daily practice, is that I'm constantly asking questions of myself. And I feel like when I'm with students or with people that I'm coaching or mentoring and I'm asking them questions, every question that is asked is an iteration of who am I? The problem is that we have so many things that we're doing all the time and so many thoughts and so busy here and so busy there that to ask someone, who am I, is almost too deep. So we have to ask other questions that slowly start to lead us to that essential question, to being able to really sit with that question. So for me, self-inquiry and his teachings are everything.
Tracee, I want to thank you very much for this time, for your time, for this conversation. It's been truly a delight to meet you and to listen to you. All good wishes with your work and your upcoming book.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. Thank you. Thank you.